the thing about it is we think, oh, we threw all that off. In the modern era, we now live in a period of equality. But the nanny state does that to you. Still has the same impact, even if it doesn't use the same kind of language. It's not as explicit. It still takes away your own sense of making your own decisions. I will be the master of my own fate, thank you. And the trade union movement in the UK has completely betrayed female members of staff. For example, in nursing, 90% of whom are women. And female members of staff in nursing are, as we speak, being disciplined at work for having the temerity to want to get changed in a women's only changing room. That's the part of growing up, isn't it? You think everything's about you. You suddenly gain perspective and you realise that maybe it isn't about you. We're telling everyone it is about you. It's about you for even longer. So you encourage them. And what we've done is we've developed a society that takes seriously the threats of young people, that if they don't get what they want, that it will destroy their lives. And instead of us standing up to them because we love them and we know it's the wrong thing, we say, oh my God, if I don't give in, then something awful might happen. And that is a betrayal of those young people.
So, Baroness Fox of Buckley, is that what you're called?
Yeah, Buckley, yeah.
Baroness Fox of Buckley. We're delighted to have you on the podcast. I've been a fan of yours for years. I read your book. I find that offensive years ago, and I loved it. But could you tell us, and I know it might be boring for you and people have asked you loads, but lots of our listeners would be from Ireland and from America, and they wouldn't know you. Could you tell people way back, you were in the Revolutionary Communist Party, and where you all came from, because you all kind of went extraordinary routes since then.
I think the main thing that happened was I was in the Revolutionary Communist Party, but then when the Revolutionary Communist Party kind of closed down, about the time when the Berlin Wall collapsed, I think a lot of left-wing organisations basically said, game's up type thing. We had this magazine called Living Marxism, which was very successful, actually, widely read across the political spectrum. And there was an attempt and there was all these subscribers to it, but no party. So I was one of the people, I was asked by other people rather than I chose it myself, if I'd help as a sort of co-publisher of the magazine. And I was a teacher. I taught in further education, 16 to 18 years old. I said, I can't, I'm a teacher, can't just give up my job. I wrote for Living Marxism, by the way, on education, on culture issues. But, I had a job. So I eventually I was persuaded to do it for a year, and I took an unpaid sabbatical, carried on teaching one day a week so I could see my exam students through. And the reason why that's significant, if you want, is I don't think anybody had really heard of me, or, we were kind of like just lefty activists or what have you. I mean, I did a bit of media, but, really Z-list, right? But, I was on those kind of like, paper review shows and all that. But what happened was that the magazine, the first issue of this new branded Living Marxism, which was rebranded with the originality of no PR whatsoever as LM magazine, standing for Living Marxism, but not the same.
I get it.
Was that we got sued for libel by one of the main news outputs, ITN. Now, I'm not going to go into all that because apart from anything else, I'll end up repeating the libel, so we don't want that. But what happened was that we kind of suddenly, this small independent magazine, and I was, after all, now the co-publisher, suddenly became involved in this major free speech, media freedom dispute. We refused, maybe naively thought, oh, we'll just say, no, we're not going to trash every copy of the first magazine that we put out. And we became involved in a kind of what became a famous libel case. And it dragged on for 3 years. Now, during that 3 years, I didn't go back to teaching because suddenly I had the responsibility of making sure that this magazine, which I had put this time into and which my colleagues were involved in and everything, I became the kind of PR spokesperson that went out and about and tried to get support for the magazine that nobody had ever heard of. And I would spend a lot of time going to, I don't know, book festivals and film festivals and TV festivals and media conferences and all the rest of it, saying, would you sign our petition, please? And do you know about the case? And so in the course of doing that, one way or another, I became better known in certain circles and I started to do a lot more media. So that was where I came from. And at the end of it all, in the year 2000, we lost the libel case dramatically. But one of the things that we'd done during that 3 years, one of the things I'd done, because this is what I was interested in, was I'd put on some big conferences. The first one was called Free Speech Wars, a big festival on free speech, which we
Wow.
did at the
In
ICA,
2000.
and then we did something called the Culture Wars at Riverside Studios, and they were sellouts. And then we started to get organisations, even like the Tate Modern and the Royal Society of Arts and the Royal Institution, saying, would you come and put on a conference for us, please? Because we were attracting lots of young, lively type people. And it was at a time at that kind of end of, 97 to 2000, where they were all trying to do public engagement work and they hadn't got a clue who the public were or how to engage them. And then they saw us and they thought, oh, maybe they can help. And so we became sort of famous. And the Institute of Ideas, what we started off as, what's now the Academy of Ideas, was the name of a summer conference we were organising. We were just having loads and loads of festivals over the summer, which we call the Institute of Ideas. And when we lost the libel case, we still had this event on. And ITN went to the judge and said they shouldn't be allowed to have that event on. And the judge said, come on, you've just bankrupted them. Leave them alone. Let them have their conference. So it was our last hurrah. It was a major success. A few people came forward and said, look, we'll give you $5,000 here or $2,000 there or whatever. Do you want to carry on? And so me and one other person said, all right then. And so we carried on
Wow.
organising public events. That's how we emerged. And because I
And
knew it was a bit well known on the media, people then took a bit of notice, I suppose.
wow, credit to you. But everybody talks about the 90s as is, oh, the freedom of the 90s, and if we could only go back to the 90s. Well, you were actually looking for free speech in the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, there was different. It was early days on the identity politics stuff, but it was there. I mean, there was different pressures. We were just starting with Tony Blair being the new prime minister. There was great excitement, but on the other hand, that was a kind of the emergence of a new technocratic form of governance, which basically said anyone with any ideological commitment had to be quiet. And just to give you an indication of where we were coming from, we were from a Trotskyist tradition, but Roger Scruton wrote in the first magazine, right, in the first copy of LM, because he said we had to go beyond left and right and take on issues around individual freedom to explore ideas. We had great support from people like Faye Weldon was one of our big
Oh, wow.
supporters, and so on. So people started saying we need a new kind of politics, and we were part of that. Even though it was a modest contribution, we were part of that. And because of the libel case, one of those things that happens sometimes when you get cancelled, you get quite famous in a way. People hear about you. It's not why you do it, but it just happens. And some of the issues that we were taking up, I mean, I remember organising an event with the French Institute in London, representing the French embassy, I suppose, here, which was a debate on multiculturalism and whether multiculturalism was a positive thing or not. And in France, that was particularly important. It was beginning to emerge as an issue in the UK, and immediately people did what they subsequently got into doing more and said, oh, it's racist to have that conference. And we did have the conference, and it was very successful, but you just were getting the sort of taste of all of the sort of ways that free speech was under assault, but it intensified a lot since.
What is your views on multiculturalism now?
Yeah, well, multiculturalism in comparison with a multi-ethnic society, which I've got no issue with, multiculturalism was a policy. And the policy basically is a relativist policy that says every single culture and every ethnicity should be treated with respect and as equal. Therefore, any criticism of any cultural practice, for example, and you're out the door, right? So,
Mm.
you're not allowed. And that obviously created a divided society. And I think I mean, I wrote one example in the book you referred to, but one of them that really kind of struck me was just, friends of mine who were involved in the arts, and they were a women's theatre group, and then they became an Asian women's theatre group, and then they were encouraged to be a Muslim women's theatre group. And every time this was kind of officialdom, basically asking them to present themselves through their identities.
I know.
And it became almost like, not, but money matters, so people say, oh well, should we? And in the end they all fell out, because actually they had never seen themselves through the prism of being Muslims. Some of them were born Muslims, but they weren't practicing Muslims. Others were religious, but they didn't see their theatre practice through that tradition or anything. They were just theatre people.
Well,
but
hopefully
but
they
they
were
ended
people who were good at their art.
Exactly, they
Yeah,
were, but it became
an
that the
identity.
art, the theatre, the production of plays became almost like second level, and that happened all the time. It happened to a lot of people, that they were encouraged by the state, effectively, who were trying to manage racial tensions, because there were racial tensions, there were race riots, there were all sorts of things happening, and they thought, well, the way to deal with this is to have these kind of more institutionalized multicultural policies, whereby we will relate to communities through their leaders as well. That was the other thing, was you suddenly got these, suddenly you got like, this person represents the Sikh community. It's like, well, were they voted? I mean, what does that mean even? So you also create this whole infrastructure which is perniciously divisive.
And did you take issue with the nanny state from Tony Blair onwards, or were you always raging against it as a fellow rager against the nanny state?
I think I've always raged against it. In fact, there was quite a bit of nanny statism in the previous Conservative administration, even under Thatcher. But you could sort of see elements of it emerging. The thing that the nanny state's got at its heart, which I suppose I've always raged against, is a diminished view of individuals to make decisions for themselves. And of course, there's a Tory version of that, which has kind of got a paternalism that's kind of quite, or historically has been quite patronizing, and almost like the Lord of the Manor, looking after the little people, and a left-leaning version of it, which is to say the poor people need our help because they're all exploited by um, you know advertising, or the rich, or what have you, and we are going to protect them. But one way or another, it diminishes individual subjectivity, effectively, and it means that you're denied the right to make your own decisions, and that's the end. The whole reason why we were all glad to see, not literally we're glad to see, the back of feudalism, but that we weren't there for that. But feudalism was, that whole period, pre the modern era, people saw themselves as in a fixed position in society. You were a serf, or you
Yeah,
were a knight, or you were, and you kind of like, nobody ever assumed that's where you were. It was just, God given. You weren't able, and part of the development of modern philosophical thinking, and the big breakthroughs, everything from the Renaissance, and obviously culminating in the Enlightenment, and then its fallout subsequently, was a decision that, or a discovery rather, that we weren't fated in our roles in society. You could change, you could move up or down, that you could make decisions that would affect your status in the world. And obviously these things have had a massive impact on the way that women were treated, that women were in a fixed position. And it might have taken longer, but obviously women started to say, no, we're not, we're not, we don't need to be protected. We're not inferior. We're not second class citizens, so on and so forth. And that, of course, was true in relation to race relations. It partly affected the whole way that slavery was viewed.
yeah,
The slave trade was, a grim and vile and physically brutal regime. But actually, sometimes, if you kind of read historical documents, slave owners almost saw themselves as being good slave owners or bad slave owners, and the good ones were like, almost like they owned people. And you can see, the British aristocracy is very much like that. They're the lord of the manor, and they've got these nice little tenant farmers who they're kind of quite, they're kind of like own
yeah,
them, right?
yeah.
Now, the thing about it is we think, oh, we threw all that off. In the modern era, we now live in a period of equality. But the nanny state does that to you. Still has the same impact, even if it doesn't use the same kind of language. It's not as explicit. It still takes away your own sense of making your own decisions. I will be the master of my own fate, thank you. My own destiny is in my own hands. And it's that aspiration which allowed people to overthrow slavery, it allowed women to get the vote, it's allowed liberation for all sorts of people historically, and it's a tradition that I'm very much part of.
Yeah. You know, when I think of, you know, those women in the theatre group you were talking about, and then the kind of identity being put to the forward, and then I think about my own life and mental health and this extraordinary boom in mental health that has gone so badly. And you put the nanny state in, and you realize this overdiagnosis has really been made embodied with over, you know, with the nanny state, if you follow me, that everybody is a little bit sick and we have to look after them all, and it's a new form of paternalism, and it's incredibly insidious. I think it's much more insidious and much more destructive because people aren't clear. In the feudal system, you knew who the villain was, you knew who the big boy was, and you knew who you had to fight against. Nobody, well, not nobody, but lots of people aren't quite sure what they're up against when you're saying City Hall now, because City Hall is often a very nicey nice teacher and a nicey nice counselor and a diagnosis and then another diagnosis and then maybe a prescription. I know you've spoken a lot about overdiagnosis. And where are you at? How did you notice it?
First of all, I was originally millions of years ago, very briefly, but for about 5 years, I worked for Mind as a mental health social worker in the community mental health social worker. So I've always been interested in mental illness and mental health. And there was a massive row that went on. We're now talking, the mid 80s, early to mid 80s, about how you broke the stigma of mental illness. And the funny thing about it was there was this row which basically went along these lines, which was progressive people in mental illness, mental, health work, said, if we can convince people who are well that mental illness is a spectrum, it'll really help. Because we can say that if you like, it's like getting a cold and then you end up with pneumonia. So if we basically have everybody with the poor mental health, but sometimes it's just a bit depressed and so on. And the idea was that you then would remove the stigma from people with schizophrenia or manic depression or what have you, people with chronic illnesses, that somehow everyone could think, oh yes, that could be me, and the danger always was of relativizing mental ill health and putting people on. Now that kind of row went on, so I had that in the back of my mind. I lost the row. I basically said we shouldn't lack the courage to fight for and defend people who've got schizophrenia, even though they're an unattractive group of people, you know, to gain public sympathy for. You can't just get out of that by trying to pretend everyone else could get schizophrenia if they're fed up one day. That sort of row. So I was involved in that. So that's ages ago. Forget all about it, right? But then I started to notice just that it became fashionable to say that you had a mental health problem. And of course, I was very sensitive because, by the way, when I started the job with Mind, I was so shocked. I didn't know what mental illness was. And then I realized what mental illness was. And the tragedy, the total devastating tragedy of psychosis, of losing your mind, made me, passionately committed to, you know, realizing what a terrible thing that was for somebody, right? And why, and awful, right? So therefore, I couldn't. It would drive me mad when people say, "Oh, I'm a bit mentally ill." It's like sort of, oh yeah, a bit pregnant, almost, not quite, but almost in this category. So I've been sort of sensitive to it. Anyway, when I wrote the book in 2016, and I was trying to work out genuinely why young people were actually demanding that we looked after them and keep them safe. And I mean, young people, I mean, 18, 19, 20 year olds when they went to college or left home. And one of the things that I realized or one of the things I was looking at was the increasing therapeutic intervention into education. Now, by that time, I was teaching, and I'd been teaching for a decade or so. And I also noticed that it was the beginnings of that whole thing where, parents would come and say, you can't be too hard on Johnny because he's got ADHD or he's got dyslexia,
What
or
year was this now? Yeah.
this is like it. So it's in the build up to, I'm trying to remember, 80, mid 80s onwards, but like more maybe the end of the 80s, but the first half of the 90s,
Yeah,
and also as a trade union representative.
of course.
And yeah, and I was NAP. I mean, the union doesn't even exist. That's how old I am.
So they're all
NAPV.
millionaires, the trade unionists. But
I
anyway.
know, right? No, but I was like just the local rep, But I organised two strikes, So I was sort of. But anyway, I noticed that in trade union, go off to NAPV national conference or regional conference, and they all started saying, we've got a problem that we're all being bullied, right? And as staff,
Bullying a trade unionist.
by our pupils, and we've got to have anti-bullying policies. In other words, we started to see the encroachment of some of this combination of both therapeutic politics and identity politics in its early days, starting to affect both professional practice in teaching and how you related to students, and the trade union movement. That was the shocker from the locker. It was like, what's happened there? And people saying, I can't cope at work. And we had a number of major disputes when I was nothing to do with me, but my colleagues or whatever. And people would go off on stress leave. What you
Yeah.
did was you'd get into trouble at work and you'd go on permanent stress. And we had loads of people off on permanent stress leave. And that was because, by the way, the trade unions were quite weak, or they didn't know how to do it, and they were going for sympathy. So all of this sort of is meshing around in my mind, and so I just became very interested in it. And so I started thinking, this isn't real diagnosis. This is a sort of step away from that. And the language of mental ill health and mental illness was becoming more popular and used much more widely. And so, then I started tracking it, trigger warnings, people saying they're getting PTSD when they kind of like heard somebody they didn't agree with. All of these things started to emerge. So, I mean, I don't know if I've done the timeline right, but it was all these different things. And I mean, I was working full time as a teacher, so I wrote a few articles about it, but I wasn't entirely on top of it, but I was just very conscious of it. And it was more that I was busy trying to teach. And I would literally say, this is ridiculous that, young people, 17-year-olds, are saying, Miss, I'm too stressed. I can't do they'd say it. I'd
Yeah.
say, don't be
Yeah.
daft. And they'd say, yeah, but I've asked to be referred to a therapist, to the college therapist. And I said, have we even got a college therapist? They said, oh, yeah, they've just opened up a new therapy centre. And then the new therapy centre, which I think had one therapist in it, ended up like being the most popular place in the college, right? And people were queuing up to go. And so rather than saying the dog ate my homework as an excuse, you got these young people being almost incited and encouraged to use the excuses as to see everything through this prism of, it's not my fault, I'm fed up. And of course, because they were 17 and 18 and 19, they were going through hormonal, they were,
Yeah.
erratic. They could easily say, but I feel really depressed. And of course, yeah, you go, yes, you're 17. That's what happens. Don't
Yeah, it's a
panic.
feature.
It's a feature, yeah.
Like in many ways, they often say about the kind of the gay politics, LGBT politics turned into LGBT because they needed a cause, because they had funding post-AIDS crisis, they had funding, and they needed something meaty to get into, and they got into the T, and so that's where their kind of their energy was directed. And when you're talking there, I'm kind of thinking of the left, and I'm thinking that they became very rich in my lifetime. That like your ordinary left working class hero was frankly, really quite well off, insofar as food, shelter, warm. You know what I mean, in the basics. And it feels like they were looking for a cause because the trade unionists, in particular, maybe it's just in Ireland, but to me they were all very rich people very often. But they really did strike, and they really got places, and they got salaries, and it feels like the left swapped money for identity, if you follow me. They swapped, and so they needed victims. And so mental health slotted in very nicely because the working class kind of, they need their dole, or they need their wages, or they need their holiday pay, they need their sick pay. They had it all. And so they needed a new thing, and it feels like they leaned in very deeply into sickness
Yeah,
and
I think
identity.
possibly that's true. I think partly what happened was in the UK now was the sense of bitterness and disillusion on the left when Thatcher got elected
Oh, yeah.
is unparalleled,
Hard to
and
describe. Yeah.
hard to describe the visceral and the left felt viscerally betrayed by the working class. It's like,
Yeah.
why would you vote for her? What happened? I mean, it didn't dawn on them. Well, we just had a terrible Labour government for years. You've just sold everyone out for ages. It's like, I mean, obviously, we know the feeling these days, but I'm just saying, so Thatcher
Mm.
had a popular vote and voted for by the working class. And so there was a kind of gradual divorce, if you were, from the left and even the trade unions from the working class in a bizarre sort of way. Certainly from the
Oh,
left,
yeah.
who just
Sure.
felt they didn't forgive them. So I think that was definitely the identity stuff emerged in that way, and in a way, what kept going was a residual contempt for the working class for not having been, not living up to the kind of proletarian ideal of fighting for socialism at every opportunity. There was a kind of disillusion almost with the working class, and so I think that created a fracture. And so one of the things, I mean, this is a sort of your point about illness. I haven't. I mean, that's very interesting because one of the things that's most depressing now, we talked about feudalism, about this kind of sense of the nanny state and this illness motif now, is I can't imagine anything more debilitating psychologically than seeing yourself as ill all the time. I mean, the one thing that happens when you're ill is that you want to curl up and, crawl away. And you want to be looked after, and you kind of associate it with you at your weakest. And so this isn't even just identity politics where you are kind of trapped within the protected characteristic that you say as a victim of racism because of my skin color and so on and so forth, my ethnicity. This is basically saying, I can't cope. I demand I'm looked after. And I think that absolutely saps the intellectual energy out of you. Now, where you're absolutely right is the trade union movement in the UK has now incited its membership. And there's only 20%, by the way, 22%, I think, of workers in the UK are members of trade unions because despite the fact that they have a considerable degree of power, lots of people are not in the trade unions because they've been useless. But anyway, the 22% that are in are paternalistically dealt with as though they're either constant victims of hate, harm, discrimination. In the way that we are familiar with, Stella, aren't we? It's like
Yeah.
student union politics, but all of the usual things that you'd imagine. But also, well-being has become a big issue. So everything is dealt with now. You kind of say, what's it like at work? People say the workplace culture is really bad for my well-being. I had this massive row recently in the Lords, and I was really shocked where they're bringing in this workers' rights bill, and about 15-20% of it, by the way, I think are rightfully putting workers' rights in improving them. The rest of it is basically power to the trade union bureaucrats and a load of regulatory crap that's going to cause a chaos in workplaces. It's going to lead to a lot of job losses. But anyway, well-being is a very big feature. And one of these things said that every workplace needed to have somebody who was in charge of creating an equality plan about the wage gap, the gender pay gap, which, to be honest with you, is so old-fashioned and not appropriate. But anyway, that's not the point. But partly, every workplace should have somebody in charge of developing a menopause action plan. And I said, and I said, so I argued against it, and I tried to put an amendment. Anyway, I said, we don't want a menopause action plan, right? This is a ridiculously patronising, ridiculous, and it's all. I'd looked at some of these model menopause action plans, and it was like train your staff, your senior staff, to learn how to have conversations with female members of staff of a certain age and go around and talk to. I said I can't imagine anything worse than this occurring at any point. Now, of course, everybody knows that if you're having a bad menopause, some people have bad menopause,
It's
you
awful.
want
Yeah.
a nice boss to not treat you like dirt and not, and be sympathetic. But this was different. This was saying every single workplace, no matter how small, or, I think more than 200 members of staff or something, had to have an action plan and act on it, or they would be fined by a regulator. And I was thinking, this is going to lead to chaos. And it's not good for female workers who we spent a long time fighting for equal rights, right? We don't want to have this sort of particular, anyway, you can imagine the sort of things I said, but I actually said it really quite straightforwardly. And somebody stood up and said, if ever there was proof and evidence that Baroness Fox of Buckley has become a far right, hardened, populace who's inspired by
Bigot.
Trumpism in America, and it's just basically, and I was like at this Labour pit, and it was late at night, and I was like, what happened there, right? Talk about mansplaining for a start off, and so on and so forth. And I realised that for they've run out of things to offer workers, right? So this
That's what I mean.
well-being and health and all the rest of it becomes their way of saying anyone who doesn't support the menopause action plan is betraying women. Now, this is at the very time
Yes.
when the trade union movement in the UK has completely betrayed female members of staff, for example, in nursing, 90% of whom are women. And female members of staff in nursing are, as we speak, being disciplined at work for having the temerity to want to get changed in a women's only changing room. And in the cases of the famous cases now, we have Sandy Peggy, who is suing her union, the Royal College of Nursing. And we have a group of nurses in Darlington who've had to set up their own union, the Darlington
Yeah.
Nurses Union, because their trade unions are so busy worried about the well-being and welfare of the trans or bisexual members of staff, right? Usually who are doctors, by the way, not even nurses, that they have abandoned female, so it's a load of nonsense, in other words, that they actually give a damn about female workers. They've betrayed female workers, and there's every single trade union has done it. They've turned their back on women fighting for biological sex realism,
And
whatever it's called.
it's really sad to see that the person who complains the most and shrieks the most and says they're the saddest has the most power.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
that's the direction it's gone.
If
You
you if
have to
you
really, yeah,
Yeah.
plead
If you look at
victimhood.
the whole Sandy Peggy case in Scotland, where that nurse is, in the middle of this ridiculous situation where Dr. Beth Upton, i.e., a male doctor who has chosen to identify as a woman and then go into a nurse's changing room. I mean, you couldn't make it up. I mean, the
Mm,
doctors used to be the elites, do you remember? And then
yeah,
anyway, but we're everything is posited as Dr. Upton's mental health, psychological
victim optim.
well-being, the harm, the doctor, i.e., the male who was identified, all of the framing from the bosses in
Yeah,
NHS 5 is about his upset, his mental health, and his well-being was put way ahead anyone else's. In other words, he screamed the loudest in the way that you've indicated, and
mm,
that is what's happened. And talking about young people, or not, we are socializing the young to think that the
scream the
way that you
loudest.
can get attention, but also get resources, get sympathy, excuses, but not just excuses, genuinely to be recognized as somebody special, is to say that you are, we that you've got ADHD, that you're suffering
Yeah,
some kind of mental disorder. What a
a condition.
tragedy.
Yeah, but arguably, I want to hear what you think of the left right. To me, it's just an anachronism, but and it's so out of date. It doesn't fit the bill. But I do want to hear where are you on this famous, ridiculous left right
Well, I
thing.
think
But
that's
wait, before
yeah,
I
sorry.
do think I want to say it just to reiterate it. I do think that the left created a space for the victim, and now it's all about the victim with the left. They don't care about money and class. They're just victim, 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 and they're leading with victim. And who's the biggest victim? And the biggest victim wins the day again and again. And that's the problem with the culture, arguably.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that, by the way, has happened internationally, and arguably and controversially is the reason why the Palestinian people have been adopted internationally by the left as the greatest victims in the world, and that's been going on long before the recent,
Totally.
conflict. Because it's like we want to adopt the victims. We're the
Who's the
victim
biggest victim
saviors.
here?
Who's the biggest
Yeah.
victim? And whoever does the PR to present themselves as the biggest
Yeah.
victim can gain that attention. I agree with you. Look, the left have been a disgrace on this. I mean, they're the ones who've embraced all this lock, stock, and barrel. It's just that,
So if
ironically,
I had met you in 1980, I presume you would have said you were far left communist.
yeah, yeah.
Right.
Until
So go
until
from
that
there.
until that until no, but I would now say, yeah, but I think this is the tricky bit. I would have carried on saying that till, I was the co publisher of LM Living Marxism magazine from 1997 to 2000. Right,
Got
that's
it.
quite late. The Revolutionary Communist Party only folded in 1997, 1996, 1997, right? So that's like, not the 80s,
Yeah.
the 90s. So I don't think, yeah, but regardless of that, the difficulty I've got now on the left right thing is that when people say, "Oh, why don't you admit that you're right wing?" It's like, well, I don't think I bloody changed, and so I resent people on the right sort of like crowing over, "Oh, you become right wing now," when in fact I don't think that's the case. I think, so, but I'm also old, so I'm aware of the fact that I've got a sort of not nostalgic, because that would be wrong, but it's kind of just a philosophical commitment to where I came from. I don't feel as though I need to suddenly, I don't feel like I'm woken up and thought, oh, I must be a conservative then. I'm on the right of politics. On a wide range of issues from the past, I would still be on the left, right? The thing is, the issues have changed. I mean, to me, there isn't a left right split in a straightforward way as to what you would think about biological sex. I mean, who knew I'd ever have to think what is the left right split on whether women should have their own toilet facilities? I mean, it's not, and even free speech is a very weird one. I mean, the left actually historically were the anti-censorship crowd,
I
just
know.
as a matter of fact. But then they became the pro censorship crowd. Almost overnight, they led the charge on cancel culture. They became the no platformers, du jour, and it made the old fashioned censorship of the right, look rather timid. And so you find yourself in a situation where you say, well, I, on principle, support free speech. And it doesn't matter whether I'm left or right. So I don't kind of wander around saying I'm on the left, unless people try and say, you're on the right, either as an accusation or as some sort of like smug claiming of me by conservative politicians. And I just think, no, neither of you deserve. I mean, I don't. I say what I say. So I think we are beyond left and right. It just doesn't work anymore. But because of my age, I have this kind of political baggage, which I have to own and don't want to denounce myself in relation to.
And what is your take on, let's say, libertarianism?
I have often been called left wing, left libertarian, and I don't. I mean, it's not a label I've given myself particularly, but I think and it's meant to be it's usually used as some kind of accusation of something. I think freedom is the bottom line core principle, and so I think I can understand why people would say that. But the problem about libertarianism as a political philosophical outlook is that often it will be, for example, say that the state should have absolutely no relationship with, running welfare or any
Yeah.
services or education. It's like, so don't be ridiculous. I don't think that, in other words. So I think that a lot of the labels historically have just are just not fit for purpose. And we haven't really developed other labels. I've gone through phases, I've said it, oh, I'm a radical humanist. I mean, these days I get accused of being a populist, and I say, yes, I'm a populist.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't know what that means either, by the way. So, I mean, I try not to run away from the labels. I mean, I resent it, those kind of labels, but in a way, I just don't find them helpful.
Yeah, but we've got to get some new ones because
Yeah,
we're being
yeah.
bludgeoned to death with this stupid left wing, right wing, which doesn't really sink to, I'd say 90% of the population don't really identify with either. You
No,
know
I
what I mean?
agree.
So what?
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
we really got to.
But it just is very
What?
difficult. Yeah, it's difficult to kind of come up with words, is all I'm saying. You kind of like, you can come up with, I mean, I hate the term woke, but
Yeah.
it caught on. And then you think, oh, okay. So when people say you're anti woke, you can't go, oh, I hate the term. I mean, I do because I'm churlish, but it doesn't help.
Well, okay,
So
that kind of brings me to my next question. You know, the way, let's say, anti woke, it feels like so many kind of forward thinkers like yourself have been caught on the back foot insofar as being called anti woke, right wing, because of a lack of claiming space of where we want to be. If you follow me, we haven't got the words for, let's say, I'm bringing myself
yeah,
into that
yeah,
now,
yeah,
but we haven't got the words for anti woke. We didn't come up with something. We didn't say, no, I'm not anti woke, I'm whatever it was.
yeah.
There's a massive, and that's what I wanted to ask you about. To me, there's a massive lack of strategic thinking around the way forward if you are a classic liberal, if you are somebody who kind of values, a certain level of looking after people in the state, but not a nanny state, if you value freedom and independence, that group who are often very intellectual, and I like them as people, and I would consider myself they're my values. We haven't come up with the words,
Mm.
and we haven't come. It's a massive disaster for us, I
I know, but
think.
I
So
think
go
things
on
have
then.
to. Yeah, no, but I think that things have to catch. I think they have to cut through, and that's what I'm saying about woke. I didn't like it, but before I knew it, it was there. And like I said, I've tried different,
Radical
I've
humanist.
played around, I kind of was doing, enlightenment thinking. Then I thought humanism, rationalist humanist. I mean, you kind of come up with these things and people are like, it just doesn't, language is more organic than that sometimes. And it just, things cut through and work. And it's very difficult if I agree with you about the lack of strategy, by the way. I'm not trying to disavow that point because I think that's a perfectly reasonable criticism. But I think language is slightly different because you can't just impose it on people. It's difficult to just kind of think that if you have a word that you could make it work for people. People have got to feel it somehow. It does make it difficult. I think that the other thing is that I I suppose that one of the problems is initially certainly it's difficult to not be defensive when people call you a racist or a xenophobe or a far right or any of these things, particularly if you're from a tradition on the left where these are, this is like
Yeah.
being called Satan, right? You think, what do you mean? I'm an anti-racist, um and it's frustrating. Oh yeah, the other word, one word that I completely lost control over, which was I always used to describe myself as progressive, right? I thought that
Oh
word
yeah.
was, I was a progressive. I was
Me
progressive.
too. I was
And
so
then
comfortable with that
yeah,
word.
and now I can't say the word progressive because that's become an insult as well. And liberal, you said about classic liberal, liberal, the whole concept around liberalism, and now we've got post-liberalism, whatever that means. But
Mm.
there's a disavowal of liberalism, even in its classic sense, because you can't keep saying, "Oh, you're a classic liberal." You know, some calling somebody a liberal is an insult, and so you and all sides have lost out on this, as it were, because the progressive liberals whose side I'm not on, they've lost control of those labels too, because they now know that they're not used as compliments for them, and that they're kind of like the liberal elite is like, "No, I'm not part of the liberal elite," as they will say. You know what I mean? So we're all struggling with it, but
Well, I just want to. I wonder if you're right. I wonder. I don't. There's a certain crowd that aren't struggling with it. The crowd that came up with woke, and the crowd that came up with transphobic, and the crowd that came up with you're a right wing bigot. They're very comfortable with labels, and they're very comfortable with being accusatory, and so the wind is behind their back. While arguably the more individualistic kind of intellectual who's trying to kind of defend a bigger concept doesn't have the kind of quick, catchy pop phrase.
Yeah, but they're just, but the things that you've just said are just insults. And woke actually came the other direction. Yeah, well, I mean, that's fine. If you want me to come up with insults, then it's different. But
No, I want
no,
us
but
to
I
come
mean,
up
no
with
positives.
woke.
I know, but they haven't come
Yeah.
up with positives for themselves.
Well,
Actually, woke didn't really work for them.
okay.
Ironically,
Okay.
they actually the woke terminology was first cut through and deployed as anti woke
I
right
remember. I woke up.
stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
but they were the one. In some ways, it was the opposite way around, which was the woke
I'm
didn't
not sure if you're
because you
right though. That there's a certain level of sloganeering. Like trans rights are human rights. You know what I mean? Black Lives Matter. There's a certain type of very kind of groupthink person who seems to come up with an awful lot of slogans
yeah,
that I think
that's
we're lacking in.
I understand that. I understand that. But the truth is that PR and sloganeering is not certainly not my forte. But it's also the case that, as I say, I don't know that that's their success. They're cheap, easy ways
Mm,
of trying to close things down. I mean, transphobic was just a clever way of using the phobia stuff, and we've already identified that the phobia stuff emerged out of that therapeutic discourse where everything became seen through the prism of mental health,
Do
and so
you
they were able
think?
to adopt it.
Yeah, do you think we're going to swing around with this? Because the mental health thing is probably bigger on my mind than even the trans issue. That this
Oh yeah,
overdiagnosis, it's really a
look,
huge problem.
a fifth of children in this country are in schools are seen to have mental distress. We've got two, I think, sessions at this year's Battle of Ideas Festival on this issue, and that doesn't even merit. It's for me the most worrying aspect. And I even argued with or argued, but raised this with Hilary Cass, who is generally a heroine of mine in terms of the cast review. But my concern was that what people were saying was, well, these young people who were asking to be sent to gender clinics, the problem is that really they are either autistic or mentally ill. And then I said, well, I'm now worried that all that we're doing is like just label shifting, right? Do you know what I mean? Like
Yes.
sometimes that might be true. It might be true in some instances where there's a genuine autism issue, but the whole neurodivergence movement and the spectrum argument around autism is now expanding so exponentially that you can end up creating just a different group of people, a different form of social contagion. And the danger, particularly for the young, on the mental illness question and the mental ill health and ADHD and so on, is that parents are even more likely to go along with this than they would in relation to the gender question. Because for parents, it's very often an explanation of their children behaving badly, often just like children, or genuinely, it's driven by genuine, not cynically, but you can get your kids extra help at school. You can explain why they're not doing very well in physics or in history or what have you, and so on and so forth. And then to have everything explained through this diagnostic route can then open doors for you. Then you can get a free laptop to help you extra time in exams and so on and so forth. So it's completely spiraling out of control in the UK. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's going to bankrupt councils. They've made serious mistakes around how they've dealt with it, because this is not about any particular political party just bought into this, and they said, oh yes, of course mental ill health is, there's parity of esteem with cancer and depression, for example. We won't make any distinction. But the problem is that many of these diagnostic labels are very subjective. They're dealt with subjectively, at
I
least.
know.
And there's also a kind of mental illness, industrial complex in terms of the number of people who are prepared to work in this field. And you've got people across the board in terms of qualifications, let's put it that way. You've got everyone from the most highly qualified psychiatrists down to the volunteers who are psychological first aiders in the classroom, and they're all part and parcel of this. And kids are surrounded by people who are constantly monitoring their mental state, and of course that makes young people self-obsessed and inward looking and preoccupied with their own psyche. The last thing you want to encourage young people who are actually part of growing up is where you actually overcome your narcissistic tendencies and stop believing that the world is all about you. That's the part of growing up, isn't it? You think everything's about you. You suddenly gain perspective and you realize that maybe it isn't about you. We're telling everyone it is about you. It's about you for even longer. So you encourage them into this, and there's nothing more likely to make you feel mentally unstable than keep thinking if you're mentally well. I mean, I can't imagine anything more depressing than being self preoccupied and not realizing there's a big bad world out there that you can act upon or learn things from or engage with, etc. But anyway, so I think that it is. You're right to say that this is absolutely the. When I say it's the next big thing, I mean it's we've ascertained it's been going on a long time, but it's absolutely much more worrying for me than anything else at the moment.
On that, there's a lie in the phrase. You were talking about well-being in the workplace, and well-being in school is a kind of similar. There's an inherent lie in the phrase well-being, because there's a presumption that if you're not feeling well, somebody needs to come in with a policy to sort it out. So we're actually selling a lie all over the place once we're talking about well-being, rather than saying, no, no, no. Being a human is, having all the kind of existential uncertainty and worries and distress that we have from the moment we wake up till the moment we go to sleep. We're up and down and worrying and thinking, and that's being human. And I think we've sold a massive, really damaging lie to young people, that they think everybody else's default is well-being. They think there's all these people living golden lives, and it's all very pleasant, and they're having great times, and I've got something wrong with me because I've got all this swirl of. And that's the lie, and that's the really damage that we've done with this mental health boom. You'd swear I was against mental health, but you know where I'm going. We've lied to people with our phrasing.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I also think when you think about the very heavy medication that you have to take, for example, if you're psychotic, it's about removing everything, and you're just like a blank, and it's the tragedy of having a psychotic mental illness is that you have to take the kind of medication that just means that I mean, I'm doing it myself now, but you're swaying from side to side. You're
Yeah.
kind of mentally blank. All the noise is removed because the noise is psychotic and psychosis. But that, in other words, what makes us human is the noise in our head. And obviously then you can lose control of that, and that's when you become mentally ill properly. But you have to have the noise in your head. That is exactly what makes you human. And you can't understand joy if you don't know what misery is. All of these things are true, right? And the existential crises that you talk about are part and parcel of what it means to be a human being, and you don't want to eradicate that, because otherwise you're just a bot. And we say all the time, about politicians when they're so, people like Keir Starmer, is ridiculed, but there's with some reason, Rachel Reeves in the UK, where they kind of literally sound like robots. It's like a robotic, repetition. You just think, for God's sake, sound human. We all know that there's nothing worse than people who appear to just be going through the motions and repeating the set aloud phrases by rote in order not to offend people and so on. So actually, as I say, the noise inside your head, the kind of the contradictory nature of the way we are as being human, is what makes it interesting. It's what makes personal relationships interesting, but it's scary too. And I think that that's one of the things is, people don't people imagine that you can remove all risk from society, whereas I think that that's a very dangerous aspiration, because actually freedom means risk. If you put somebody in prison, right, and you keep them in solitary confinement, right, they physically might well stay safe, right, but that's
That's
no
the
way to
safest
live, right?
place.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's no way to live.
We're coming up towards the end, and I'm just interested, and I know you're not qualified to know it, but I'm interested in your views. What is your understanding of people who want to medically transition, have a mastectomy, get genital surgery. Do you see this as, some people see it as it's a symptom of autistic thinking? Some people see it as a mental illness. Evidently, it's got social contagion within it. How do you categorize it? Because it's a hot subject, if you follow me, because some people say it's because of a gender soul within you. You know what I mean? And a lot of people say, well, it's not, but very few people will say, well, what is it? What do you think it is?
Well, I think it's very difficult because I don't. Sometimes it is autistic. Sometimes I'm sure that it is a form of autism, and autism is disorientating, a disorientation from one's own thinking and body in many ways, right? So I can imagine that that could be a label. Some people are so mentally ill that they do anything to be somebody else, right? But I don't think it's just that. I mean, the obviously easier way of understanding particularly young people transitioning is that very many young women hate their bodies and hate what their bodies represent. But that has always been the case, or often been the case historically. It might be worse because of the over sexualized society that we live in, but I think that would be true in many ways.
Yeah.
Puberty, developing all, I mean, being growing to be a woman physically is actually a kind of yuck thing, in some ways, right? A lot of people are like, oh my God, I don't want anyone to see my breasts are growing, or they're not growing enough, or I'm not attractive enough, and all the rest of it. And what used to happen was that people would put on a big jumper and become a tom boy,
Yeah.
or like
Yeah.
there was all sorts of expressions of it, or maybe kind of like be very shy for years when they got through the acne phase and the kind of like unattractive, and then suddenly turn out to be, something of a swan, or not care as much because they suddenly got, or whatever it would be, right? In other words, it's part of growing up. What we've now done is we've medicalized these feelings that are quite intense when you're a teenager. They really are intense. So there's that side to it, which is that I think we've given people a medical route out. And I can imagine, and not just a medical route out, but a certain glamorous route out. And there are then very particular things like young women who may have been sexually abused, in the past, some terrible thing has happened to them. So they think, I never want a man to ever see me sexually because of this terrible experience. So there will be individual cases. Undoubtedly, that will add to it. So I'm certainly not an expert, but when I've talk to people who've been attracted to this option, it's a mixture of a lot of those different things. And I think that then what is inexplicable to me, but is, if you start talking about this with very, very, very young children, presumably they're just utterly confused. I mean, there's anyone who's had anything to do with 4, 5, 6, 7 year olds,
Yeah.
they are in a they live in a fantasy world. They understandably,
Yeah.
they want to be, astronauts, ballerinas, dinosaurs, you know, dogs,
They believe in
whatever, right?
fairies.
And we don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and they make things up and they're playing around, pushing boundaries. If you create a world in which a little boy, kind of quite likes pink and all the rest of it. I mean, I'm just saying some of the cliche things. But if you then encourage that way and you reward it, and that's one of the things that I think has happened is adults reward children who go through this in some instances. And even if your parents don't, in fact, your parents are abhorred. If your favorite teacher does, or if, on the television, this is some way that you can become glamorous and a famous influencer with a TikTok account and lots of followers.
I
I mean,
know.
no, so it's so many of those different factors that seems to me to be very different to the adults who transition, who, usually mostly we are familiar with males who transition without going into autogynephilia. I understand there are different drivers and pressures. And I have known people over the years, over very many years of being old, who out of nowhere, somebody who's an effeminate, shy, socially inadequate man, who's the local librarian or whatever, right, suddenly says, "I've decided I'm a woman," and it's like, this is like a caricature, but there's somebody I've got in mind. I've lived with my mother, and she's just died, and I've decided to come out. And it's like, you're 60. What are you doing? And it's like, sort of, what? But it's so
Yeah.
obviously. I'm sure somebody more skilled than me would understand that it doesn't take a genius to work out what's happened there, right? And also that they are, very often they're just gay, but they don't want to admit
And
it, and
lonely.
they're all over.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so you've got all these things going on. And I think that in that sense, I don't understand the driver of it, but you can certainly understand the social driver of these things. And that's
Yeah.
where I think that it's very important that those of us who are involved in politics with a small p do identify that we are not prepared to accept that this is just a natural process. How can you possibly stop people who want to express themselves? And by the way, when children or teenagers say, "I want this," as a teacher and as an adult and as someone with young people in my family, I want to say, in some instances, absolutely no. You can't do that. No, I personally don't think heroin is a good idea. Don't take it, right? I'm not going to encourage you. No, absolutely no, you can't, etc., etc. And you have to do that. And when kids say, if you make me do this, I'm going to go and kill myself, you have to say, and it's hard, look, I know that you think if you're not allowed to go to Glastonbury this year, this is a question of suicide, but let me assure you, it isn't. You'll be fine.
Oh.
You go into Cornwall with us, right? This is
Mm.
quite a hard thing to do, but parents have had to negotiate these things for a long time. And what we have done is we've developed a society that takes seriously the threats of young people, that if they don't get what they want, that it will destroy their lives. And instead of us standing up to them because we love them, and we know it's the wrong thing, we say, "Oh my God, if I don't give in, then something awful might happen." And that is a betrayal of those young people.
Yeah, and just on a last point, because I really want to lean in on this point. The way we were talking about the mental health, industry, they particularly wrecked our way of dealing with suicide. So that suicide has become this really easygoing word that my kids who are 16 and 17, they throw it out. It's so far from taboo. It just means I'm depressed. Suicide yourself and stuff like that. So we've made a real horror show of the word suicide. So the parents are understandably terrified because it's such a devastating
It
event.
is devastating, and it happens, right? So you don't want to be.
Yeah,
It's the dread of every.
flippant.
It's the dread of every parent. It's the dread of everyone, right? That you think,
It's the
"Oh
dread
my
of every
God,
school, of every
every,
counsellor, of every psychotherapist.
every
Everybody's terrified of it.
university."
Yeah,
I went and spoke at one university, about 10 years ago, and the person who invited me, by the way, got disciplined for inviting me. But anyway, the themes of my book. But what had happened there was that they were having this away day, 3 days away training on issues around mental ill health and well-being and safetyism and all the rest of it, because one student had killed themselves. And I understood, you don't want to be like somebody. It was high profile. It was all over the papers.
tragedy. Yeah.
And they were being blamed. I mean, there was no reason to think that. When I was at university, a long time ago, during the time that I was at university, 3 people committed suicide while I was at university in different years. That I vaguely knew one of them quite well, vaguely knew 2 of them, and it was terrible. I mean, it was terrible, but actually the whole university didn't reorganize itself around those terrible tragedies, and terrible tragedies do occur. And I, as somebody who I'm particularly obsessed with the issue of suicide as it goes,
Oh,
you
me
would do
too.
anything, and you would do anything to intervene to stop somebody killing themselves. The tragedy
Yeah.
of afterwards and so on is just, it's too awful. But you can't also, just the way you cannot chain children to the bed in case they run in front of a car. You cannot chain up your partner in case they might go out and fancy someone else and leave you. You can't deprive people of a life in order to save their life. And that's the difficulty that we've got. And you can't give in, particularly to young people who weaponize these things in such a way. By the way, why wouldn't they, right? They're like opportunist, they're quite selfish and narcissistic, and they think it's fine to say all this stuff. We've got to acknowledge that we don't do them any favors by accommodating to their instant demands.
And every time, you know, my kids go to the toilet, there'll be a poster at the back of the toilet door saying, "Are you feeling suicidal?" You know what I mean? And then they glamorize any death by suicide that's happening in the community. They glamorize it, so it's an absolute horror show that the trusts.
And we're about to bring in a law here, which is an assisted suicide bill. And one of my themes is, you can say it's for terminal illness, but it's got every celebrity in town queuing up to support it and all the rest of it. And I will be arguing in the Lords, that this is normalizing suicide. All those years of the stigmatizing of suicide, not for good reason, right? For good bloody reason, right? There is a reason why you want to say, please give life another chance. Right? We can help. It's not so bad. It really is not. Please, please, please. Somebody jumping off the bridge, you plead with them, don't do it. You would do anything to stop that happening. And then we very casually, like you say, we've normalized it on the one hand by accommodating to this discourse around young people and suicide. And then we bring in a bill where the state is able to be given sanction to take your life because life's not worth living. On that
Disaster.
happy
Well,
note, on
it's
that happy
yeah, you can fix it. You're in the House of Lords, so go get them. Thanks a million, and I'll see you at the Battle of Ideas. Take care.
take care.